But what most people don't know is the extent of deaths in custody in Australia. And the extent means this, that there are more deaths in custody in Australia than there were all deaths in custody during the peak of apartheid South Africa. There are more Aboriginal deaths in custody in Australia than there were all deaths in the peak of apartheid South Africa. The myth is that most deaths in custody in Australia are actually Aboriginal deaths in custody. It's actually the other way round. It's non-Aboriginal deaths in custody that are a majority of deaths in custody. Most people think that there's about half a dozen deaths in custody at best in each state of Australia. That's actually wrong. The figures are this, and the reason that a lot of people think that what I just alluded to about how many deaths in custody in Australia is because we've got to remember that the Royal Commission in 1991, the 2 reports that came out with the 339 recommendations, which some have been implemented but the majority haven't, they were premised and guided by 99 documented Aboriginal deaths in custody between 1980 to May 1989. Little has changed, they continue at the same rates. The reality is that between 1980 to 2000, there were 1,442 deaths in custody, prisons and police services. 1,442 deaths in custody. Now, that's horrific. It's one of the worst records in the whole world. Who'd think that of Australia, one of the leading OECD countries, one of the presumably higher standard of life countries, if we forever, as we do in this country, disregard our Aboriginal brothers and sisters and the neglect and the abandonment they endure in the NT and other parts of Australia and metropolitan Australia. But 1,442 deaths in custody from 1980 to 2000. Now, to give you an idea of where we're at now, from 2000 to 2007, we've had 601 deaths in custody, prison and police, in Australia, all deaths in custody. To give you an idea of 1990, it was 74 deaths in custody, 9 were Aboriginal. I'm picking that date because it's 1 year before the reports came out, the Royal Commission into deaths in custody, which were predominantly based around Aboriginal deaths in custody. 10 years later, 87 deaths in custody, so nothing has improved. 87 deaths in custody, of which 19 were Aboriginal deaths in custody. The rates continue, and they've actually increased. Now, the big argument is, why do they happen? I've got, some understanding of why they happened. I've actually changed my PhD from building anti-corruption practices in management, which I had my heart and soul set on, or whatever, to argue the house down, and also research and document and offer new theory about the building of practices, such practices, to deaths in custody, to document in this country a document that actually collates all the data. Like, I was blown away when I actually started researching, because I'm on the Deaths in Custody Committee, have been for 2 years, its trustees and its campaign committees, and I just wanted to get the figures in my head about how extensive they actually were. And when I actually started compiling through Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian Institute of Criminology, and they've got a national data-based program, or whatever, the Australian Institute of Criminology, which was actually a recommendation from 1991 that had been created to report on this data. And part of those recommendations also included the formation of the Deaths in Custody Watch Committees, and that they be funded, and that they report back to the various agencies or whatever, which would report back to government, so we can monitor and see where we're actually at. But under the Howard years or whatever, they were quickly eroded, and then the funding was stripped, because they had their strings attached funding, and this sort of information actually unsettled them, because they were adamant that there was no systemic racism or discrimination. Now, Deaths in Custody Watch Committees, when they were ripped of their funding, collapsed around the country. The only one that really exists now is actually the West Australian one, the Deaths in Custody Commission in West Australia. Yes, there are some small groups in Queensland that have built themselves, Sam Watson from the Socialist Alliance and others, from the Palm Island incident, and have, involved themselves, but they're groups of 6 or 7 without funding or whatever, and with heart and soul, arguing about the black deaths in custody, deaths in custody period. I could allude to any number of deaths in custody this year in New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria, and West Australia. We had 3 documented ones in the media or whatever, in March alone here in West Australia, and then another couple the following month, and we've had a couple recently. But the Deaths in Custody Watch Committee in WA is actually built up on funding sourced through various groups, for instance Amnesty and other organisations and private donors that don't want to actually disclose who they actually are to keep us going. But part of the committee actually has built itself on a Build Communities Not Prisons program to ensure that we fight for the rights of people who shouldn't actually be in there. Defaulters, in terms of fines, shouldn't be in jails, and a lot of them are actually Aboriginal brothers and sisters, or those from the working classes who are really poor. Those who are from the middle and upper classes or whatever can always pay their way out of any fine or whatever. But should they be in jail? Their wages could be guarded, for instance, or even their settlement benefits at what the courts prescribe at $20 a month or something like that, whatever's actually affordable within that. Why are we filling up our jails with prisoners and building more jails to actually achieve that? And the argument, and why I raise that, is because in my own research I've discovered this. Of those 1,442 deaths in custody, and of those 601 deaths in custody in the first 7 or 8 years of this new millennia, and these rates are actually continuing still in the last 3 years, they're going at the same rate. They're not actually, in terms of racial discrimination, they're not actually proportionate to any data or indicator that we could actually argue that the police or the prison services are racially discriminating against people. The rates are actually proportionate to incarceration rates, the rates of deaths in custody. So what we have at the incarceration level in terms of people being imprisoned is obviously more in this state. For example, 68% of all juveniles are actually Aboriginal, whatever, right? So their rate of incarceration is higher than non-Aboriginal. Now that, quickly to just capture the argument, typifies to me this piece of evidence, or indicator to this evidence, that discrimination is actually at the incarceration level, and what we have subsequent to that is substandard treatment of people in terms of the custodial level. In this country, in terms of policies, whether they be police pursuits, in terms of handling of prisoners, in terms of their rights, in terms of their incarceration, in terms of the size of cells, in terms of referral services, in terms of educational facilities, in terms of services available, there's very little comparatively in terms of other countries or whatever within the OECD to support people. We have possibly, it's still to be evidenced completely, but we definitely know without doubt that we have one of the world's highest incarceration rates of Aboriginal brothers and sisters. We have one of the world's higher incarceration rates of the working classes, or those who could argue they come from abject poverty. So it's actually more to do with a class division. We're pretty harsh on the poor in this country. We're pretty harsh on the working classes. It's abominable to actually consider that we've got over 2,000 deaths in 27 years from 1980 to 2007. And like I've argued, we've actually got to address this at the incarceration level. Who should be in jail and who should not be? Diminish those who are actually in jail and find other ways to, assist them in improving their lives and contribute to society, or whatever, and help them through that recourse. Rehabilitation struggles to happen within the jail system. Rehabilitation has to happen, outside the jail system and through the criminal justice system, through the judicial system, which is actually quite harsh on, all people, or whatever, right? But more harsh on those from the working classes and those from abject poverty and our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. I think what we need in this country, what needs to be pushed for again, is one, an education campaign to make sure that the Australian consciousness is actually aware that we have these many deaths in custody. And why is it so in a country like this? And why do we have more deaths in custody than the peak of apartheid South Africa? Where the death of Steve Biko rolled the consciousness of the world, where the assumption that people were dying in jail as a result of their rights being diminished, of being abrogated, or of them being arbitrarily arrested, or whatever, and their poor handling at the hands of the South African police or the prison system. And yet we have more deaths in this country, so the same questions that were asked there need to be asked here. The only way they'll actually be asked is if the Australian consciousness, community, society, every sector is actually made aware. Politicians who I've actually approached did not know the extent of deaths in custody in this country. You know more than the average citizen. So what we need to do is actually argue, yes, it'd be ideal if we could start funding again Deaths in Custody Watch Committee. Yes, if we could reinstate the national data program of the Australian Institute of Criminology and have that report to the Australian Senate, or to an agency that reports to the Australian Senate once it's verified the information and interpreted, so we can monitor how many deaths in custody actually happen in this country and why. We need these parliamentary inquiries. Personally, I've been approaching every politician imaginable and putting it to them at every forum where I've had an opportunity to speak with them. You know, I've approached, I won't name them all, but I've approached Labor, Liberal, Greens, all of them or whatever, right? And with the leverage that some of them are actually happening with this presumption that there's an erosion of the two-party system because of balance and checks of other parties, which I don't believe actually exists. We're sustaining the two-party system, but that's another argument. What we need to do is actually make this story, you know, a happening in the Australian consciousness, because the only way, what I've noticed in my experience, politicians don't pick up the story as part of change agency, as something that they actually have to do. It's like same-sex marriage or whatever, right? Until it actually became, arguably through the polls, or whatever, right, you know, something that most Australians are actually supporting, whatever, right? Australian politicians who are a little bit averse to picking it up. We've got more and more now actually picking up and carrying the baton and arguing, you know, for an amendment to the 2004 Marriage Act, or whatever it's called. Similarly is what we need to do with this. We have to get it out there into the consciousness of people, and for enough community to be aware of it, so it's actually something that the politicians are happy to run with. They don't run with most of the issues that I know that actually affect the poor, the working classes, Aboriginal brothers and sisters, till the media actually runs with them a bit, till they're actually profiled, or, you know, till, as one politician said to me horribly once, till it becomes a sexy story, or whatever, right, and it assists their political brand, or whatever, right, you know. And it's a shame that most politicians in this country don't understand that politics is actually a calling. It's about our management systems, and management systems, you know, in terms of government and governance should be about equitable social inclusion. A lot of them think that a lot of these people deserve what actually happened to them too, and that's actually a problem, because we have a meritocratic view with a lot of people in this country or whatever, right? And that they brought this upon themselves to be, you know, charged with something in the first instance. But we've got to also remember that no one's guilty until proven so, and innocence is a rightful presumption. And also, this is why we need a Human Rights Act in this country, and the deaths in custody, what's actually happening in this country in terms of deaths in custody should be a driver to actually protect the rights of people, so they actually aren't eroded once you go into jail. You know, you don't have to vote if you're in jail, I think, and you can't vote if you're serving any sentence above 3 years. You've got to be 3 years and down. All your rights and liberties should be protected, except for capital punishment in Indonesia. They've actually got a civil rights bill, and the rights of all prisoners in Indonesia are actually protected. I found it easier to send computers for a computer recycling program that I put here in Australia to Indonesian jails, because they've got a right to education, to improving their lives, and to getting them here. When I met the superintendent of a particular prison here in Perth, a little bit south of Perth, I couldn't get them in, whatever, because they were worried about, you know, the internet and what they could actually do with the machinery in there, whatever, which was ludicrous to me. But there was no bill to actually protect their right to an education. Yes, they do have some facilities in our jails, but I visit jails and I go there, and recently I was there, you know, pushing what I usually do, alternative pathways for people into education and, you know, other ways. And you know, I'm just I walked into a particular jail recently, I'll mention that one because it's a remand facility for the most part or whatever, right? And I saw these Indonesian fisher people sitting in there, and they were actually arrested for being on the asylum seeker boats coming here. And I just saw them there learning English in one class, and I asked them what they're actually in for. I thought they'd actually been in the little dinghies that were coming here fishing and trespassing, and they got 3 months or something like that, or were out to be deported back. And they got arrested for fishing to feed the crew and the people on the boats, or whatever, right, in international and in Australian waters. And I was sort of stunned. I said, so what are they doing, deporting you back, or whatever, right, you know? And there were about 30 of them sitting there, learning English. And they were on their way to Albany, or whatever, the jail down there. 5 years.